there's such richness in each community, in each culture. And like, I don't feel that it would be a healing for that to be lost. And, that is part of what I believe, I know that I've been healing, it is that relationship directly with the earth and with the ancestors. It's like, that's the commonality that we really all do share as people who are relearning, like, how do we be indigenous? How do we belong to the earth? How do we belong to ourselves? And how do we belong to one another? Our short time on this planet. So like that taproot down to the earth, like there's something there that's calling and waiting and asking for us if we're willing to really listen, and not just, I heard someone recently call it, putting all the stamps on the psychedelic passport. Like what, and like, what if that's not really all that necessary to do in order to get what it is that we really need to receive?
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Psychedelic Conversations podcast. Today with me a very special guest. So let's welcome Nicole Lilly. Thank you so much for creating this time to be here with us. Welcome.
Thank you so much for taking the time to have me and putting all of this effort into making this beautiful educational podcast for everyone. Deep bow to you, Susan.
Thank you so much. And for our listeners, I'd like to just say a few sentences of your bio just to give a context so they get to know you a little bit more, but we will have your full bio and your links in the show notes if they wanted to come over and check it all out. So Nicole is an integrative healing artist, educator, and guide, providing education, guidance, and support for personal development through a holistic framework, including body, mind, heart, and spirit. She has been in the healing arts and transformational arts 12 years and holds a master's in body psychotherapy from Norapa University, along with a license in massage therapy. She skillfully guides individuals and groups choosing to embark on their journey with expanded states of consciousness and botanical allies, such as sacred mushrooms. I like that you call them botanical allies. We'll probably get into that in a moment. Nicole, thank you so much again. And just want to begin this conversation, as always, with your background story. What brings you to this work?
Yes, thank you, Susan. Probably like many people who are attracted to this work, my experiences began very early in life, and my having a relationship, however distorted or not that was as a young person. And I actually began foraging mushrooms when I was about 15 years old. This was before there was the internet. And so that relationship goes pretty far back for me. And then at one point, as is possible with young people, a lot of things happened at home and trauma was coming up in my life and things started to really turn dark. And I took a good long break from the psychedelic world and entered into the corporate world, which has its own layers of darkness to contend with. And eventually got out of that and found my way to a yoga and shamanic and energy training in Bali that really turned a huge corner in my life. And that was also the first time that I sat with the mushrooms again in like 15 years. And it was a solo journey for me, in just beautiful on the beach. And that whole trip and whole trajectory just really changed my life. I decided to go to grad school. You take this 3 years of commitment, deeply studying the body, my nervous system, how to manage my own trauma, work through that. And that was a really important component for me. And I wove in a little bit of cannabis medicine at that time. That was the first training that I actually did, was with medicinal mindfulness in Boulder, because cannabis had just become legalized, and sat with the mushrooms a bit, but it wasn't the main focus for me while I was deeply immersed in that part of my life. It was really after I came out of that particular emergence that I started to find community within the psychedelic spaces, and really integrated that in a bigger way from my own healing and transformation. And things just really naturally unfolded from there for me. My somatic skills translated really well in ceremonial spaces, support spaces. And, I wanted to be kind of legitimate as someone who'd gone through a master's program. So I spent some time training in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy and cannabis-assisted psychotherapy, and did that for a while, working with a lot of trauma in a clinical environment. And, the truth is that was just not really the right environment for me. And so we had this beautiful, gift of COVID that came along, and I was laid off from that work, and had simultaneously, things were changing and shifting in the legal landscape here. So Denver had decriminalized mushrooms. This was actually what a lot of people were looking for. It wasn't really ketamine. And so I started having people ask to hold space for them in this way. And it's been a natural unfolding from that time forward. And at this point, my work is really focused on a sacred relationship with the mushrooms themselves. And so there are many beautiful, allies and options out there that are available, but I've been in a process of deep listening. And at this time, that just feels like where I want to put my focus, my presence, and my expertise. And my experience is that they really have so much to offer humanity and the earth. And so, yeah, I could keep speaking, but that's the overview.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. So one of the reasons I got attracted to your work, obviously, I follow you on LinkedIn, and there was this beautiful post that was very different than the usual, and I could tell that you're really connected to the nature, the medicines beyond the therapeutic model or even the shamanic model. And I knew there was something else there, and you already said it. It's more of the energetic kind of work behind that goes into this work. And yeah, there was definitely a unique something about your posts and the way you connect and the way you bring your voice and your message in this, psychedelic renaissance or the revival that we're experiencing. And that's when I realized and also acknowledged how important it is to be trained in all these different modalities. And just learning about psychedelics that itself is not enough to hold space or guide people, or, it's just not enough. And it's just really humbling to see that all these modalities coming together actually supporting what is now unfolding as the whole new model in the Western world, right? So I would like to take, if you could speak to that and your experience. Did this just come about through the pandemic lockdown where you had more time to reflect? Was it just like you always had that intuitive guidance towards working with the medicines with all different modalities? Like, how did that come about?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And my first impulse is like, like the top-down model, right? Which is really the somatic model, and it's working from like the bottom up and turning the traditional way of seeing things on its head, which is very top down and mind down. And so this was very much an emergent process for me in this way that mirrors the development that has been most useful for me in my life. And so I don't know what it would have even been like for me to go into it thinking like, oh, I want to be a guide or a facilitator, because it's just never been my construct. That being said, like there was always this interest. So even when I was in graduate school, the MAP studies were happening in Boulder. And so I was attending talks. Like I said, I attended a trip sitter, training with cannabis through medicinal mindfulness. And so there was this way that like my young wounded self, that young wounded part, was seeking some sort of repair all along. And it feels like it's really matured now. And so it didn't just begin with the pandemic. It really was more of a multi-layered unfolding of like, oh, okay, well, yes, I'm going to attend this ceremony. And now I'm being invited to assist the ceremony. And like there's a lot of natural ease in the skills that I learned in my somatic program, which was very experiential and very embodied. And many times very uncomfortable to be, really witnessed in the fullness of my being and witnessing others in that way. And so it was such a natural fit for that space, and expressing things through the body and really being there with people, mirroring that process, engaging with them. So there doesn't even have to be words. It's just this felt sense of attunement. And, there is someone here who is with me that is actually giving me full permission to express in this particular way. And, that's very different than we see with the blindfold and the Hopkins and, like, let's just do this really high dose, which has its place. So it was this incremental unfolding. And one of the messages that I had received in a journey was, when you're aligned, things will flow. And that's been a big guidepost for me over the years. I like to conceive of integration most simply as what's your sacred yes and what's your sacred no. And knowing what that feels like energetically in the soma, and throughout the entire being. And so that's really what has guided me. And it's been an invitation as much as it has been me looking for particular things and really paying attention when it's like, oh, yeah, this is interesting to me mentally, but there's actually something that is not harmonized and in resonance for what I need to do. It was really, once Denver decriminalized mushrooms, I would say is probably the biggest catalyst for being able to step forward and do the work in a way that has more safety and visibility around it. Still dancing in a gray area much of the time with that. But it also made people more comfortable to specifically start asking these questions and becoming curious, and that the conversations were being had in a bigger way inside of community. And so all of those different pieces really feeling held in that process. And all along, still doing my work. I strongly believe in practicing what it is that I preach. So, it wasn't, my young self is really proud of me, but it was not something that I went out seeking per se. It's just a way that has come to be, that has a natural resonance for who I am, and lights me up. Yeah.
Yeah. It's almost like an organic growth and organic progress, rather than figuring out the outcome and having that goal to arrive there. It's rather sort of going with the flow of the progress and organically just arriving to a mature place of seeing things more objectively and having a more sort of a bigger perspective. So that's what I'm hearing. And I think this is very much like the structure of the psychedelic work, isn't it? It's kind of like taking, who was it? I think it was one of the lead psychotherapists for MAPS. She said, I love what she says. She goes, sometimes they say there is no structure in psychedelic work, or the psychedelic working, on yourself, inner work, or the work through psychedelics. But she goes, actually there is, because there is a timeline where your younger inner child, or the wounded child, grows up and matures. And I think that was kind of like spot on. And this is what I'm hearing. It's so beautiful. Could you talk to us, and if our listeners tuning in for the first time and they have no idea what somatic therapy or working this, the concept of somatic therapy or somatic or combining the psychedelics with soma, how would could you please talk to us? What does that mean? How does that look like?
Yeah. Well, there are different schools of thought around it, but essentially it's working with the body as a foreground for material, in contrast to taking the mental concepts and constructs. So it's a bottom up process. It's the idea that 95% of what actually resides in the mind is in the subconscious, and that those subconscious contents are actually held in the tissues. They're held in the cells, in the way that we breathe and respiration. And so all of those various components, it's taking a step back from what our interpretations are about things and really slowing the process down to notice what is actually happening from the layer of the physiology. And I even want to say the energetic system, which is slightly different than the nervous system. And there's some distinguishment between these things, but allowing that information to arise from the subconscious, held in the soma, so that we can bring it up for awareness and receive new information and insights. And sometimes just these somatically led processes to prepare people can bring forward new information and insights, before there's ever any sort of, mushroom ingested microdose or otherwise. So it's a really beautiful way to tap into our own innate medicine, really, and that the information is there. It's just really waiting for our attention, and it's waiting for us to slow down enough to go, like what's under that, and what happens if I start to take away the known stories, like what's actually true here. So that's one way of conceiving of it.
Yeah, I think definitely agree. The body has a massive role in this healing arts processes. Yeah, especially in the psychedelic. So yeah, and so when you trained in different modalities, for example, would you intuitively be there, present for the person going through whatever they are in the in their processes? Would you be how would you know how to support? This is like a question. If it's coming from a listener, for example, how does one know which modality to choose or tap into, or even study to begin with? Because now, as you know, psychedelic-assisted therapy is being promoted, and so many organizations are developing their own training programs. And sometimes I get questions like, how do I become a psychedelic-assisted therapist? Where do I go and get the training? But then it's not just about learning how to assist somebody through the psychedelic experience, but like you said, what about the other stuff? Like, how does one choose which way to go about? So what would you say to that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is where really longevity and time and devotion comes into play. I don't think it's fair for one to think like, okay, I'm going to do a year of training and, in a thing, and then have this whole suite of tools that I intuitively know how to pick and choose from. It really is taking things individually and one at a time, and spending some time with each of those modalities to learn how they functionally operate within oneself. And, then through practice, whether or not that, that's paid, but it has to be through the experience of actually trying it on one by one. initially to see what do each of these have to offer. And then, we can start to see overlaps and the interplays and the interface between, oh, well, this method is a lot similar to this, and there's some commonalities that I can start to pull from and draw from. And then then the integration of those start to get woven together in a more intelligent way that becomes natural. It's kind of like riding a bicycle or something along those lines too, right? Like you have to kind of practice and get it into your muscle memory and understand it. And then reading the individual in front of you and knowing how they may most receive and respond what it is that's being offered. So yes, it really has to be an experiential felt sense process. Again, going back to the idea of the soma, we can't really choose these things from the mind. There's a certain way that it feels in the body. And when we start to be with clients in their fields, we also can feel what is their presence like in our body, and what's the harmonization there. And so it's kind of that, again, going back to that attunement and that felt sense experience, that I may go, oh, okay, there's something here that I'm feeling could really resonate for this particular client. And I maybe know what ideas or constructs that they're coming in. So how do I want to bring this language? And then it's a process of observation. How does this land for this individual? It's not necessarily about always getting it right. It's actually about the willingness to experiment with the person in front of us, because that also gives them permission to experiment and not feel like they have to get it right. And so there's this process of joining together that happens. And it's actually a bit more playful than hierarchical when we start to approach it that way. And if we're approaching it with the spirit of play, there's almost no getting it wrong. Yeah. With the caveat of having really learned those things, deeply. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. So again, we always come back to facilitator knowing how to navigate these territories and also having their own experiences, making sure that they have done all the necessary steps in, working on themselves, because, if you don't understand the territory, how would you relate? Also the modalities. Yeah, I am seeing a lot of people coming through now, trained in somatic therapy or somatic body psychology, that they are coming in sort of coupling with the psychedelic medicine. So I'm seeing that a lot. So I guess it's a good match together. Mm-hmm. It's a really good match, feels like.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of nonverbal, spaciousness that can happen in both of those modalities. And so, even the capacity to, as a space holder, to sit in that silence and recognize that there's actually so much that's happening in the field, right? And to not just kind of be a wall around that, but oh, wow, how do I actually start to match whatever's happening in this energetic sort of way that's nonverbal, it's very unspoken. And, to kind of layer in, this isn't really from the world of somatics, but this is where bringing in other things like sound, and instruments can be very valuable. And that's one of the things that I use in my process sometimes. It's what's the vibration that's happening in someone's nervous system here? Does this feel like a rattle? Is this a drum? What's going on? And so these other ways that are not psychotherapeutic in nature to, again, attune with that individual in service of helping to amplify and whatever it is to allow it to be expressed in its fullness.
And yeah, this is beautiful. And that's why we call it healing arts, because it's not the Western model of just sitting, coming into therapy, there is a cognitive and intellectual making sense of things, and then there you are with all these different modalities. You try and explore everything, allow the person, and also I think it's reciprocated in the process, because the person then really opens up to more expansive thinking and being in the space. I find that there's nothing wrong with the traditional therapy, because I'm also trained in that way, so I understand, but I think these times require much more creative approach, especially in the psychedelic space, I believe. So I'm guessing you feel the same.
Absolutely. And I feel that like that creative essence, that life force is really fundamentally what it is that so many people feel like they're missing, and they're really attempting to tap into. And, and we can label that certain things. We can label it depression for, having a suppressed life force. We can label it anxiety for having like a life force that doesn't quite know what to do with itself and how to express. And so opening that creative frame, and just again, like, playfulness is such a big piece that I think that people are missing. And so that's where things like the mushrooms can be incredible allies, to start to open these experiences up and open up the levels and layers of curiosity. And it's like, whatever you have to say in the space is all welcome. And like, oh my gosh, and yes, of course this happens for more than you. And opening up those creative frames, it's like there's this whole symbolic and metaphorical world that resides on a different plane than the earthly plane. And it so tapping into those archetypal realms and the causal realms of experience really gives people so much more possibility than what they may have come to believe that they have available to them. And opening up that possibility, in my experience, also starts to unravel the trauma in a different way, because it's like, oh, like I can really feel the expansiveness of this. And then what is the story that I want to create out of that trauma? It's not that it didn't happen, but how do I want to start to create if I am this archetypal mythic being who's living in a human body on the planet?
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, totally. I think, especially post-pandemic, there's a lot of depression, sadness, grief, loss, and all of that. I think definitely the way forward is the lightness, bringing more lightness into the work. It's already dark. It's already intense. It's already, there's so much layers and depth to it. So I think, yeah, definitely agree with that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's a big component too, right, of like feeling ourselves as nature, feeling ourselves as the cosmos, like that these are just like, these are our ancestors as well. It doesn't have to stay in the human realm of experience. And I really encourage that, because when we like, nature in some ways is infallible, right? When we turn to the earth, like her heartbeat is there, the resonance is there. And like, that's a reliable thing that we can attune to. And, humans by our nature, we're polarized, we're fallible beings. And as lovely as community, is, and, as necessary as that is, that doesn't come without its shadows as well, and without its challenges as well, and without a great deal of misattunement sometimes. And so it's the both and so learning to self-resource and, know thyself, and be able to stand in who I am, and helping others to stand in who they are, and rise up and be an expression of that, and tap into something that's got such deep ancient roots. Like I feel like that is such a medicine that is needed for our time. And we need every person in the community who can, ultimately learn to do that and hold that space for themselves, so that whatever comes up in their family systems, in their ordinary world, that is not some separate community that's doing psychedelics. Like that's the work of integration.
I love that. So what are you seeing right now? What are your observations in terms of, because I remember speaking to one of our guests, and he said one time, he said, Susan, when you're in something, for example, psychedelics, if you're an explorer of psychedelics and you're in these circles and communities, you forget the rest of the world is not like that. But I think there is a shift now, and rest of the world or everyone, I think there's a global sort of interest now developing because of the resumed studies and researchers and all these organizations like MAPS and so many other organizations that are coming up now, and like Imperial College in the UK, for example. They're really leading the way now, and seems like the mainstream media is tapping into it. Even the people that 2-3 years ago wouldn't have an idea what psychedelic is, now they are Googling and they're learning, and they want to search and search for these kind of podcasts and just listen and understand what are we dealing with. So I think we're in a very interesting era. And you said, do you see that ultimately we're going to have to integrate them in our lives in whatever shape and form? They're coming so fast, meaning psychedelic substances or medicines, they're coming into our lives in, like, again, a bit like the 50s, the revolution, the first wave, but they're coming really fast. And somehow, what are you seeing and observing in terms of like different communities, countries, cultures? How will they start to integrate it into their lives? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Gosh, that is such a big question. Well, presently I live in Denver, Colorado. And so, like we were the first in the United States to really put forward decriminalization at a city level. And then it has just recently, there's been some other policy changes at a statewide level where there's decriminalization and a regulated access model that's being put forward. And so, I'll be honest, like that was quite stressful in the community in a lot of ways, because you have, kind of, again, the bottom up of the community and who holds a lot of wisdom and a lot of knowledge, and people who've been doing the work and kind of slowly building. And then you kind of have top down special interest, people with a lot of money, and those two worlds really colliding for a little bit. And so, there's been some conflict of interest, even with trying to birth this. So it really feels like it's this birthing process that's trying to happen, and there are going to be some painful moments that come with that before everything is just kind of out in the open and with the light. And so I perceive that there's going to be a lot of space holding that is going to come well beyond an individual sort of level, but it's going to really call forward people to get clear on their integrity, their values, how they want to operate, seeing things through different frameworks and ethical lensing. So you've got decriminalization coexisting alongside a regulatory model. What does that look like? Who ultimately has the say in all of this? And so, these are very big existential questions in some ways that I think are going to have us like not just confront the psychedelic space, but actually confront like, how do we show up for one another in communities? How do we show up for one another in our household spaces? What are the things that are on the table to talk about? And, can we really put forward community models if we aren't having a level of vulnerability with one another, and starting to really see through some of the illusions behind this? So it's like you have the presentation, and then you have like all of the real stuff that's behind the presentation that has to be dealt with. And so it very much feels like it's this larger communal birthing psychedelic process that is underway. And, I don't know the answers, but again, for me, I just have to come back to what's my sacred yes, what's my sacred no, what feels aligned here, and staying very centered and present in myself, and where do I perceive some gaps that I can start to fill. And one of those gaps that I actually do recognize and that I've been working to fulfill is like self-guided journeys. We have a lot of space holding and trip sitters and facilitators and therapists. And for me, in my personal experience, holding space for myself has been tremendously important. And there's not a lot of discussion around that. And so that's one of the areas that I am focused on right now, is equipping each person to really show up for themselves in a certain way, and with community touch points as well to support that. So that way, scalability doesn't really necessarily become the question of the day, and affordability is not the question of the day. It's if it's like, oh, I've been through my process, I know what this is like. I don't necessarily have to charge you money. I don't have to have an ego about being a trip sitter. Like those things just factor in a little bit less. And again, to me, it's coming back to that bottom-up model and knowing myself and doing your own work. And I see that as a gap in the space, and it's one that I'm working to try to fill.
That's wonderful. Nicole, I think ultimately, psychedelics or not, therapy or not, ultimately, in this conversation, I'm hearing that the goal is to give people the confidence, the agency, the choice, and build capacity in them so they can, rather continually relying on others and outsourcing and that codependency, because I think the industrialization has created a humanity that is always codependent to their doctor or their therapist or their parents or partners and the workplace. So I feel like the bigger picture here that you continually reinforcing is the idea of liberation from all of this, these models that people can finally breathe and liberate and become their own, agency, right? That's like the key here. I'm hearing from how you speak. We may be using psychedelics, other modalities, therapy, but ultimately your mission is to liberate each person so they can become their own, container, their own autonomous being in their own skin and comfortable and express their lives and more authentically aligned, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we, to me, that changes the conversation. And it changes the conversation from a pathological, reparative model to one that to me is so much more inspiring and has the capacity to, to bubble up and start to shift our systems in a meaningful way. And I might not ever see it, fully in my lifetime to the degree that I can imagine. But we, putting those things in place, and to whether or not, psychedelics or, plants and fungi are involved, like to really just kind of see this as a lifelong work in progress, because that, people are so starved for meaning because of these sort of systems. They can, like, okay, and now I'm doing the job that I don't really love. And like, I'm just kind of going through the motions of my life and there's no vitality here. And again, going back to those possibilities for people, and that's contagious. I mean, like there's a somatic resonance. There is a heart resonance that extends, like 30 feet beyond the field. And so it's like, wow, like what if I just am psychedelic? Like I am that, and I am a liberated being who just has this way about me. And like the person that I'm in contact with, they may never even need to do that, but they can experience the change through me, and that has a ripple effect as well. And I see that potential for like family systems where it's like, okay, like my mother and father, they're not going to take mushrooms, and they really don't need to, because like I am embodying the change for me. I am embodying the change for my family, and to me that's like also ancestral healing in a really beautiful way, and that ripples from past to future.
Oh my God, that's so beautiful. So they get to experience it through you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This is so powerful stuff. Because otherwise, if we focus too much on the psychedelic renaissance and what the medicines are telling us, or how it's coming really strong and forcefully, and then everyone's too busy trying to figure out who qualifies to be a facilitator, who qualifies to be a shaman or the therapist, or there's a job, everyone's after a title again. It's just no different than the Western initial model anyway. And we're back to square one. Who is going to be the leading person in this space, right?
It's so absolutely true. And I caught myself doing that. So last August, I renounced my psychotherapy designation on stage, actually, to hold myself accountable. But then I kind of proceeded and recognized, I'm like, oh, if I'm guiding in this particular way, I'm still doing the exact same thing. And so there was this moment for me in the spring where I really got very clear on what was next, like what was the next assignment. Not that I have to give up all of the things that I'm doing, but it really came through very clear. And, the words were teach a man to fish. And it's like, wow, okay, like I've been really being confronted with my ego here. What happens if I'm willing to not impart this as a training to more guides or this, or, be any particular important person? What happens if I actually share what I know with just, whomever is really in the space that is ready to receive that with a good heart and in a good way? Like that to me feels so much more empowering. And
there's something that I like to honor in this space of doing self-work, which is the law of reciprocity. I feel like when we become too scarce, like the scarcity mindset, and we become too rigid and having that fear, if everybody learns this, then there's a lot of obviously negative thought process around this, that people try to, I'm also listening to complaints about how expensive these services are, that the real people who need it actually cannot access it because of the financial challenging situation. And but the way you're now approaching is just kind of sharing it freely, knowing that it's going to go to that person who's ready anyway, and who is not ready will carry on with the, there's a divine timeline, divine timing in people's readiness and building capacity to hear and receive. So, and just kind of letting that flow and just let people receive if they're ready. And that is exactly the essence of what the medicine's trying to teach us, right? This is exactly what they teach us. I mean, I listen to a lot of people who go through a really deep transformational plant medicine dieters, and they always say plants want us to connect and have autonomy and care for each other and share. So this is the nature of everything. And again, you know, coming back to the earlier conversation of like who's going to be having the highest title, leading spaces and all of that, it's again misses the whole point.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely, you know, and I've tried the kind of retreat model a bit as well, and I was like, nope, that's not it. You know, that's another Western approach, trying to like do it how we think that it works, but it's like that's not actually what's happening in these indigenous communities. It's embedded in their way of being. It is them sitting across from their neighbors, and you know, that's what that is. And so the retreat model, you know, it can be lovely, and I don't feel that it's going to really be sufficient in order to do the depth of work. You know, people ultimately will be replacement for the people in our lives who we have the challenges with. And so we might, you know, there might be some drama that gets worked out there or gets played out there, acted out. And unless it's done in a really intentional, healthy way, and that's what people are signing up for, I'm not so sure about that model either. So that's not to say that, you know, I don't need to be compensated for how I'm educating or teaching people, because, you know, as you know, it takes a lot of time and dedication and extra support to put these things out into the world. But ultimately, it's, you know, it's a language that we all can learn to speak, and it's not the language of psychedelics, it's the language of the psyche, which is the language of the soul, which is how the earth speaks to us. And it's how the divine speaks to us.
Yeah, because psychedelics, ultimately, they're just kind of door openers, aren't they? They're not the ones that make the change happen. It's, again, like you said, maybe we are the psychedelic, maybe we are the medicine. And maybe that's what we need to come to understanding. And this is the work that you want to give voice to. Like, hey, you know, if this is not about creating leaders or, you know, people to manage people, but it's about this time that you start to do your own and get to that agency yourself.
Yeah.
Wow. And I think you answered my question already, because I was thinking, in this crazy noise out there about the psychedelics and how it's going to be structured, how it's going to be, you know, what kind of models, what kind of, you know, because if you look at the globally, we're so mixed and diverse and culturally, and lifestyles and upbringing and family dynamics. I mean, it's just so limiting to think that we can create structures when it comes to self-work. Self-work is ever expansive, ever evolving, progressive path. And yeah, it just, again, misses the point. This conversation is very psychedelic type, by the way. Just like, it's so beautiful. Thank you for this.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a real pleasure to be in this. And, you know, yeah, there's such richness in each community and each culture. And like I don't feel that it would be a healing for that to be lost. And, you know, that is part of what I believe. You know, I know that I've been healing. You know, it is that relationship directly with the earth and with the ancestors. It's like, you know, that's the commonality that we really all do share as people who are relearning, like, how do we be indigenous? How do we belong to the earth? How do we belong to ourselves? And how do we belong to one another? You know, our short time on this planet. So
that's so wonderful. You know, another guest of ours, early days, she said that she decided to work with a native medicine carrier in Peru, and she decided to obviously work with ayahuasca. And then, but she came from the Scandinavian countries and Eastern European, and she was in one of our experience, like the medicine was directly saying, what are you doing here? This is not your land. Go back and recover your own roots. Learn about your own medicines, like your tradition. Where do you come from? Your lineage.
Mm-hmm.
In your own land, you know, you were born there for a reason. What are you doing in Peru in the jungle? You know, it's a different culture. You're not accustomed to it. You don't know anything about this culture. Go back and learn your own old lineage and bring that to your people.
Yes.
It's so moving.
Yes, absolutely. And this is one of the reasons that I feel like, you know, I'm committed to the mushrooms, because this is where I started early in my journey. You know, it was where I was born. It was, you know, in the South, on that land. And there was a way that I got to know that process, you know, not through another culture, not through another lineage. And, you know, one of my primary mentors, like, she's deeply connected in with her Celtic lineage, and that resonates, you know, with more of my ancestry and European background as well. And I feel like that's really worth listening to. And again, like that taproot down to the earth, like there's something there that's calling and waiting and asking for us if we're willing to really listen, you know, and not just, I heard someone recently call it, you know, putting all the stamps on the psychedelic passport. Like, what? You know, and like, what if that's not really all that necessary to do in order to get what it is that we really need to receive?
This is so beautiful. Nicole, thank you so much. I know we're coming to the end of our conversation. Just would like to, of course, ask you for your last words of wisdom, but also your projects. What are you working on now? And all the things that you can share with our listeners before we let you go.
Yeah. So what I'm presently working on is going for a round 2 of an offering that I made in the fall, which is an immersion, an online immersion. I'm calling Embodied Journey Foundations, the Art of Self-Guided Journeys. And it is specifically around creating a small, intimate container of individuals who want to gather and learn how to do this for themselves. And so the idea is, you know, that there's instruction, there's dialogue, and that there's a designated week that people carve out to journey together and then come back and integrate together as a group. And they do this from the comfort of their own home. And it's really me, you know, it's a short amount of time, but I'm doing my best to try to transmit some of the skills and wisdom that I've accumulated over time directly to people, with that idea of sovereignty and creativity and growth for oneself. So I'm hoping to have a new version of that sometime early next year. I don't have a specific date just yet. And then other than that, you know, I'm just doing the work that I do with individuals as well here in Colorado, and, you know, just really listening, Susan, for what is calling to me and what am I calling in simultaneously and stepping forward. And so I don't want to take on too many projects. And that's actually been an important practice. It's like there's so much going on in this space that one could get involved in. And so for me, I'm like, okay, I'm just kind of staying in my own lane and really using that life force and that creative energy to be generative in a way that I think is going to have some good longevity. So those are the things that are up in my world. And you can find the Embodied Journey Foundations at the Luminous Guide website. So it's theluminousguide.com. And my individual self is NicoleLilly.com. So feel free to peruse either of those.
That's wonderful. Thank you. We'll be adding those into the show notes as well. And last words of wisdom, what would you like to say to our listeners?
Oh, gosh. You know, thank you, Susan, for holding the space and for me to allow my voice to come through in this way. Like it's really deeply meaningful to me. Like, let us all be in a place of evolution, right? And let us all be willing to get it wrong and change our minds and, be in process with that. And also to be a light. Like you said, there's so much shadow, there's so much trauma, and we can really put a lot of focus and get stuck there. And so I just want to invite, like, whatever and however it is that you decide to open your heart space, let that be a light for the way forward.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much again. And for our listeners, I think they should definitely follow you on LinkedIn. I think you're one of the most inspirational person that creating content. And you can tell, I think after having this long conversation with you, I made my mind what this was, the attraction to your post. It's definitely that mature approach, like maturity in your work and your message, and really kind of, like you said, staying on your lane, doing your own thing, and just contributing to the world in that way, regardless of psychedelics or not. But it's really, really kind of doing the part and showing up in that way that just you, so unique to you, and you're not following any modalities or the structures that, how should you be showing up in that space, but just doing your own thing. I think that's what is so contagious and attractive.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, LinkedIn is the only social media that I'm on. I know that I should be on all the other things, and I'm not right now. So you can find me there. You can find me at my websites. I send out a beautiful newsletter as well, once or twice a month. So if you're interested to hear more of my words, I would invite you to sign up.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that, for your offerings. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. Hope you guys enjoyed this conversation. It's really been like a ceremony for myself. I think I need to take a few hours to just kind of integrate this. It's so beautiful. If you have any questions, you want to share something, do make sure you do in the comments, and reach out to Nicole and myself. Don't be shy, and I'll talk to you guys later. Thank you. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Psychedelic Conversations podcast is designed to educate, inform, and expand awareness. For more information, please head over to psychedelicconversations.com. You can also share with your friends or leave a review so that we can reach more people. You can also join us in our private Facebook group to keep the conversation going. This show is for information purposes only, and it is not intended to provide mental health or medical advice. Thanks for listening.